Since the duel between Rome and Carthage, there had been no such world war. It involved all the civilized peoples. It extended to every part of the accessible globe. There was the peril that the supremacy of one race and culture would be imposed by military force upon all others. In no world conflict have the issues been more real and vital. In none has the duty to defend a righteous cause been more compulsive upon the British nation.
The tone is unmistakable. The words could only be by Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of Great Britain, during the tragedy and triumph of the Second World War. But they're not about the Second World War. Instead, they're about another great, though now largely forgotten conflict, fought 300 years ago at the beginning of the 18th century.
It was a war to save Europe from domination by Louis XIV's France, and it was the first truly global conflict of the modern age.
The British were victorious in that war also. They were even led by another Churchill, Winston's great ancestor, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough.
But John Churchill was more than just Winston's ancestor. He was his inspiration, and he was his subject. For Winston spent the 10 crucial years before the Second World War researching and writing a massive biography of him. Marlborough, His Life and Times.
It's almost impossible for us now to think of this as a serious activity for a great politician, because very clearly none of our politicians, none whatever, could possibly undertake such a task. They lack the ancestry, they lack the experience, they lack the appetite, and they lack the talent, and the most they can do is have their memoirs ghosted. I think this matters, for it was writing his biography of Marlborough which, above all, transformed Churchill from a politician and, frankly, rather a rackety one, into a statesman. It sharpened his rhetoric, it clarified his ideas, and it prepared him for the immense intellectual task of leading the Allies to victory over Nazi tyranny. So this is a work of history, which changed history. It's a book about a great war leader, which helped make another, greater war leader in an even bigger, bloodier war.
This is Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, where our story begins.
Winston Churchill was born in this room on the 30th of November, 1874. The baby was a typical product of English rank and American money. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was a New York heiress. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill there, was the third son of the 7th Duke of Marlborough. And this room is one of over 40 bedrooms at Blenheim Palace, which was designed and built for John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, and remains his family's seat to this present day.
Winston never lived at Blenheim, but as the Duke's grandson, he was a frequent visitor. So we can imagine him as a small boy roaming these spectacular rooms.
But Blenheim is more than just another stately home, however magnificent. Above all, it's a building designed, inside and out, to tell a story. The story of war
and victory. Outside, the facade is decorated with martial statuary, giant gilded cannonballs. Even the spires on the roof are fanciful representations of fizzing grenades. Inside, a glorious series of large tapestries, a sort of 18th century graphic novel, show in historically accurate detail how Marlborough fashioned his troops into the greatest fighting force in Europe. Outmanoeuvred and outfought Louis XIV, and turned the new nation of Britain into a superpower. So it's no wonder that the young Winston developed an early and lifelong fascination with soldiering. This shows in his first surviving letter, written when he was age 7, from Blenheim, and addressed to his mother to thank her for his Christmas presents.
My dear Mama, I hope you are quite well. I thank you very much for the beautiful presents. Those soldiers and flags and castle. They are so nice. It was so kind of you.
At Harrow School, Winston was in the army class and then went on to Sandhurst, graduating as a cavalry officer in the Hussars. He was no toy soldier. He saw action in India, the Sudan, and South Africa. His experiences provided the material for another great passion and talent, writing. His dispatches as a war correspondent and several well-received books made him a public figure and helped get him elected to Parliament. While he sat in the Commons most of his life, Winston never stopped writing, producing a constant stream of articles and books. He even tried a motion picture screenplay. But the project closest to his heart, where the soldiering and the writing came together, was his biography of Britain's greatest general, his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough.
This is the Long Library at Blenheim, where Churchill came to research Marlborough's voluminous papers. The resulting book would take him almost 10 years to write. It would have 1 million words, and it would fill 4 huge, magnificently bound, heavily illustrated volumes. It's one of the most remarkable works of history ever written. And it is so because it's the work of someone who wielded power, the sword, as well as the pen.
Yet, the book was written when it seemed that Winston's days of political power were behind him. In 1929, when he signed the contract to write the book, he'd just lost office after spending nearly 20 years in the cabinet, where he had been Home Secretary in a Liberal government and Chancellor of the Exchequer in a Conservative one. All through the 1930s, Winston languished on the backbenches. It was a period that bears a striking similarity to today. A financial crash led to a prolonged economic depression, with which heavily indebted governments struggled to cope. In Britain, the upheaval led to the downfall of the first Labour administration and a period of coalition government. In Germany, it led to the rise of fascism, and in Europe, to a seemingly inexorable drift towards another world war. It was against this background that the 4 volumes of the Marlborough biography were published, one by one, between 1933 and 1938.
One hesitates to use a word like magic when you're talking about something as sober as history. But with this book, there is repeatedly a sense of you're not quite sure which century and which tense anything is referring to. Marlborough is the great war leader who is not simply the great general, but the manager of a great international coalition. In exactly the same way, Churchill in the Second World War is going to be just that. Except, of course, Churchill is writing about Marlborough almost as though he were in the present, before Churchill himself has moved into that future. You see what I mean? It's as though Churchill has suddenly made the past a story that runs into the present and then into the future.
Chartwell, Winston Churchill's house in the country. It was a considerable extravagance for a man with only a backbench MP's salary. Fortunately, Churchill was also the highest paid author of his day. For the biography of his ancestor, John Churchill, Duke of Marlborough, his publishers advanced him a total of £20,000, not far short of £1 million in today's money. That gave Winston the means to employ a small team of specialist historical researchers. Their job was to produce memoranda summarising the documentary evidence. Once Winston had digested these, everyone would retire to his study, where he would pace up and down, dictating his text to a shorthand secretary, often until 3 or 4 in the morning. One of his researchers, Bill Deakin, wrote later,
"One felt exhilarated. Part of his secret was his phenomenal, fantastic power to concentrate on what he was doing. My memorandum was only a frame. My facts were there, but he had seen them in a deeper perspective. His penetrating mind revealed insights I had completely missed."
The Marlborough biography begins with a brilliant display of Winston's historical imagination. The man who built Blenheim Palace was the richest and most powerful aristocrat in Britain. But he was born plain John Churchill, the son of the man in this picture, an impoverished country gentleman. With his long hair and lace cravat, the first Sir Winston Churchill is the archetypical cavalier, a supporter of King Charles I in his war against the Roundheads of Parliament. When the Cavaliers lost the Civil War, King Charles lost his head, and Sir Winston lost his estates. Without the means to support his family, Winston the Cavalier was forced to move in with his mother-in-law, who had backed the other side in the Civil War and was as ardent a Roundhead as he was a Royalist.
In Chapter 1, Winston the historian fashions an unforgettable picture of the household, straitened in circumstances and bitterly divided in ideology and allegiance, into which John Churchill was born in 1650, when England was briefly a republic.
The Lord forbid that politics should divide us. The Lord forbid.
Hard must those years have been. A crowded brood in a lean and war-scarred house, between them and whose owner lay the fierce contentions of the times.
Then Winston speculates, subtly and sensitively, about the effect of such an upbringing on the boy and his character.
The two prevailing impressions which such experiences might arouse in the mind of a child would be, first, a hatred of poverty and dependence, and secondly, the need of hiding thoughts and feelings from those to whom their expression would be repugnant.
That ability to keep his true feelings hidden would serve John well. Fortunately for the Churchill family, England's experiment with republicanism lasted just 11 years. On the 25th of May, 1660 at Dover, the two sons of Charles I set foot again on English soil.
James, Duke of York, the King's brother, but of a vastly different temper. His gracious Majesty King Charles II, whose charm and ease of manner is matched only by his ceaseless energy, be it in the affairs of state or of love.
Charles II fathered many children, but none of them was legitimate, and so James, as his brother, was heir to the throne.
By God's grace, I'll restore to the country its old good nature, its old good manners, and its old good humor.
And get murdered for your pains. The way you go about, unguarded.
Brother, I'm safe enough. They'll never put me out of the way to make you king. Mr. Pepys, I don't agree.
At last, Sir Winston's steadfast loyalty to the House of Stuart was rewarded, with a position for his daughter, Arabella, as a maid of honour in James's household. Her brother John soon followed her as a page. What happened next is described by Winston with mock prudishness.
Our readers must now brace themselves for what will inevitably be a painful interlude. We must follow the fortunes and misfortunes of a maiden of 17 and her younger brother as they successively entered a dissolute court.
King Charles II is famous for his string of mistresses, but his brother James was, if anything, an even more avid womanizer. Winston tells a story of how Arabella here was out riding with the Duke when she was thrown from her horse. She lay senseless upon the ground, with her skirts thrown up to reveal her naked limbs, and more, for remember then, ladies did not yet wear knickers.
We are told that while Arabella's face presented no more than the ordinary feminine charms, her figure was exceedingly beautiful, and that James was inflamed by the spectacle of beauty in distress and also in disarray.
After this beginning, it didn't take James long to seduce young Arabella, who became his mistress. And this was just the beginning of a long, intimate and complex relationship between the Churchill family and the royal house of Stuart.
Thanks to James's patronage, John Churchill was soon a rising young officer in the Guards, equally dashing under fire and at court.
He is this God, this vision, this man of sublime handsomeness, beauty of figure. He is infinitely charming. He is a courtier.
But now John courted royal displeasure by beginning an affair with the king's long-standing mistress, Barbara Villiers.
She was 29 and he 20. For more than 3 years, this wanton and joyous couple shared pleasures and hazards. The cynical, promiscuous, sagacious, indulgent sovereign was outwitted or outfaced.
Eventually, the story goes, Charles II discovered John hiding in a closet in Barbara's bedchamber. The young man fell to his knees in terror. The king laughed the matter off. Go, he's supposed to have said, you are a rascal, but I forgive you, because you do it to get your bread. Winston doubts the story, but his research has proved that Barbara did indeed pay for John's services by giving him £5,000. This was a colossal sum, which John characteristically used to buy himself an annuity that gave him financial security for life.
Moralists have been shocked by the fact that John did not squander Barbara's gift in riotous living.
As a young man, Winston, who was no oil painting, had considerably less luck with women than John. But it all came good in the end. This is the Temple of Diana in the grounds of Blenheim Palace. It was here, on August the 11th, 1908, that Winston Churchill MP proposed to, was accepted by, Clementine Hosier, a 22-year-old beauty with whom he'd fallen in love earlier that year.
Winston had carefully stage-managed the scene. He'd engineered Clementine's invitation to Blenheim, and he'd chosen the spot. Perhaps forgetting, since Winston was no classicist, that Diana was a virgin goddess who had forsworn both men and matrimony. Now, why the trouble? It can hardly have been because he thought that Clementine would be impressed by Blenheim, since she was the least likely person in the world to be swayed by aristocratic pomp. Rather, it was because this place mattered to Winston.
Winston knew that Blenheim was in part the fruit of a successful marriage. For John Churchill would probably never have amounted to much had it not been for the girl he met in 1675. Her name was Sarah Jennings.
At the mature age of 15, she was already a precocious, charming figure. Fair flaxen hair, blue eyes sparkling with vivacity, and a nose well chiselled, but with a slightly audacious upward tilt. She also was entirely self-possessed, and by inheritance she owned, when roused, the temper of the devil.
John and Sarah were eventually married in 1677. It turned out to be a lifelong love match, complete with the occasional lover's quarrel. Winston, who himself was the beneficiary of a deeply happy marriage, writes movingly about the Marlborough's relationship, though not as movingly as Sarah herself, who, long after Marlborough was dead, turned down a proposal of marriage from the Duke of Somerset, the grandest grandee of the day, with magnificent contempt.
If I were young and handsome as I was, and not old and faded as I am, and you could lay the empire of the world at my feet, you should never share the heart and hand that once belonged to John, Duke of Marlborough.
For both John and Winston, marriage was the rock upon which their whole lives were built.
In one important respect, however, the two marriages were very different. Clemmy had the good sense not to get too involved in Winston's political career. John and Sarah, on the other hand, were that very modern thing, the power couple. And Sarah's power depended on her relationship with the woman in this portrait.
This is Anne, the daughter of James, the king's brother. Anne was third in line to the throne after her father and her elder sister, Mary.
Anne and Sarah probably first met when Sarah came to court in 1673. Anne, aged 8, formed a schoolgirl crush on Sarah, aged 13, and it blossomed into a passionate, though platonic love affair that was to last for almost 30 years.
But there was dissension in James's family. While Anne and her sister Mary had been brought up as Protestants, sometime in the 1670s, their father James converted to Roman Catholicism. It was a decision with devastating consequences for the House of Stuart.
Sarah's relationship with Anne placed her on the very fault line of the schism that ran through the royal family. A schism that was both religious and political. It was a position of unique influence which John and Sarah would use to shape the course of history.
Germany, 1932. The government, reeling from the economic effects of the Depression, is under siege from right and left. Communists and followers of the National Socialist Workers' Party fight bloody battles of the street. As they steadily gain ground in elections, it seems that the National Socialists, or Nazis, under their leader Adolf Hitler, may soon be in power. To foreign observers, the Nazis were a perplexing phenomenon. Were they a bunch of buffoons, a menace to the peace of Europe, or a useful bulwark against communism? At first, even Winston Churchill himself was ambivalent.
I had no national prejudices against Hitler at this time. I admire men who stand up for their country in defeat. He had a perfect right to be a patriotic German if he chose.
Winston's main preoccupation during the autumn and winter of 1932 was trying to finish Volume 1 of his biography of his ancestor, the Duke of Marlborough.
In many ways, the most remarkable chapter in this first volume is the one that should really be deadly, which is, this is the background of foreign policy. It's called The Europe of Charles II, but in fact, it's a brilliant analysis of choice. Essentially, what he says is there are two choices facing England at this point. One is to be swallowed up by this hegemonic, totalitarian, ideological France. The second is to resist it.
The supreme fact upon the continent in the latter half of the 17th century was the might of France. Her civil wars were over, all internal divisions had been effaced, and Louis XIV reigned over a united nation of 18 or 19 million souls, possessed of the fairest region on the globe.
The wealth and power of France was symbolized by Versailles, the great palace built by Louis XIV, a monarch who wielded absolute sway over his subjects and who was worshipped almost as a god, the Sun King. Versailles is a hymn in gilt and stone to Louis's military ambitions.
This room, indeed, is known as the Hall of War, the Salon de la Guerre. And its principal feature is this great bas-relief of Louis XIV, dressed as a Roman emperor and forcing a crossing of the Rhine as he tramples German barbarians underfoot. It commemorates an actual incident, the capture of Strasbourg, which carried the frontiers of France right up to the Rhine. Churchill thought that Louis's ambitions stretched even further and that he aimed to reconstitute the empire of Charlemagne, which had once embraced, on either bank of the Rhine, France and Germany. With ambitions like these, none of Louis's neighbors could rest in peace. Instead, in Winston's words again, they cowered beneath his unrelenting lash in pain and fear.
During the whole of his life, Louis XIV was the curse and pest of Europe. No worse enemy of human freedom has appeared in the trappings of polite civilization. Insatiable appetite, cold, calculating ruthlessness, monumental conceit. Petty and mediocre in all except his lusts and power. The Sun King disturbed and harried mankind during more than 50 years of arrogant pomp.
What I think is striking is Churchill's ability to, if you like, personalize ideology. He highlights Louis's colossal vanity, this sense of a king always strutting in front of a mirror, what we would call the cult of personality. Louis as the god of war, Louis as a Roman emperor. It's this image of war as vanity, as the supreme expression of the leader. And of course, he sees the very beginnings of the Nazis. He doesn't meet Hitler, but he watches him and he sees this enormous, overblown personality. He notices the cult of war. He realizes, just like Louis XIV's France, Louis, remember, dies on his deathbed saying, "I have loved war too much." And he sees Hitler as somebody who loves war too much, creating a nation which is, every aspect of which is mobilized for war.
But in the 17th century, as in the 1930s, it was not England, but Louis's immediate neighbours who were most threatened by France. Louis coveted the rich towns and cities of the Spanish Netherlands, roughly speaking, modern-day Belgium, then a province of the declining Spanish Empire. But the Dutch to the north, fearing that they would be next, determined to fight for the Netherlands. Their leader, William of Orange, became Louis's implacable foe.
England's vital, centuries-old concern with the control of the Channel meant that it was more or less inevitable that she would join in the war. But would she ally with France against Holland, or Holland against France?
And again, as in the 1930s, this choice was not just a matter of power politics. It was also a question of ideology, not of fascism or democracy, but of Protestant or Catholic.
Following the great 16th century schism in Western Christianity, known as the Reformation, both England and France had fought a civil war about religion, but with the opposite result. In England, Parliament and Protestantism had won. In France, it was the monarchy and Catholicism that was triumphant, as here in the royal and religious splendours of the great chapel at the Palace of Versailles. In both countries, however, there survived an important minority of the defeated religion, Protestants in France and Catholics in England. But they were viewed with profound suspicion by both the government and the majority as potential subversives or worse.
To Louis XIV, Protestantism was a hostile ideology. He was determined to uproot from France. He began a campaign of forcible conversion. It climaxed in the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, an act which Louis had commemorated in this allegorical painting which hangs in Versailles.
The edict, which was issued by Louis's grandfather, King Henry IV, had brought the terrible French wars of religion to an end by offering toleration to Protestants. But in 1685, Louis decided that he could no longer endure what he saw as an affront to his Catholic conscience and his kingly dignity. The edict was revoked, and Protestantism was outlawed throughout France. The allegory of the painting depicts the revocation up here as all sweetness and angels and light. But the reality, just hinted at down here, was very different. It was confiscation, extreme violence, imprisonment, exile, and even death. In short, what we might call religious cleansing.
As Winston worked to finish Volume 1 of his biography, events in Germany began to echo Louis XIV's France. Elections in 1932 established the Nazis as the largest party in Parliament. And in January 1933, Hitler became Chancellor in a coalition cabinet. To most observers, it all seemed democratic enough. But within weeks, legislation was passed which granted Hitler power to rule by decree. Soon after that, legal discrimination, persecution against Germany's Jewish citizens began.
In Britain, criticism from both politicians and the press was muted, as no one wished to offend Germany. However, on the 13th of April, Winston rose in the House to warn, bluntly and in unambiguous terms, about the real nature of the new dictatorship which had seized power in Germany, about its persecution of the Jews, and about the threat that it posed to the whole peace and security of Europe.
Eines überspitzten jüdischen Intellektualismus ist nun zu Ende.
Churchill is astonishingly quick off the mark. And the reason is he's watched Louis XIV doing exactly the same thing. And I think it's the experience, it's the soaking in the world of the late 17th, early 18th century that enables Churchill not only to understand the 1930s better than his contemporaries, to understand them faster. At exactly the moment that everybody else in Britain is saying, Mr. Hitler is a man that we can do business with, Churchill says, look what he really is. He is murdering the Jews, and if you don't stop him, he'll murder you.
In January 1685, King Charles II of England suddenly fell ill.
The king is dead. Long live the king. Long live the king.
Charles was succeeded by his brother James. For John Churchill, the accession of his long-standing patron and friend could have been, should have been, the gateway to influence and wealth. But James was a Catholic, whilst John and Sarah, like James's daughter Anne, were sincere Protestants. And James was determined to coax, or if need be, coerce his realm back to her ancient allegiance to the Roman Church. Soon, John Churchill, the courtier, would have to choose between his king and his God. By late 1685, Louis XIV's brutal campaign against French Protestants was gathering force. Thousands and thousands of refugees began to pour into England.
To the English, these refugees were living proof that Catholicism meant persecution and tyranny. James, so more and more of his subjects felt, was plotting to become an English Louis XIV and subvert the liberties and religion of his people.
But though James was a Catholic, his heirs, his two surviving children from his first marriage, Mary and Anne, were both Protestants. The elder, Mary, was married to William of Orange, the military leader of the Dutch Republic. And so everyone knew that, when King James II died, England would once more have a Protestant queen, her consort, the leading opponent of French aggression.
It was a comforting thought. But in June 1688, after 15 years of childless marriage, James's second wife, Queen Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. This changed everything. James was no longer a Catholic aberration in an otherwise Protestant royal family. Instead, he was the founder of a new Catholic dynasty that might rule England forever. The thought, as Winston put it, was unendurable to Protestant England. The solution was to invent a lie, a noble lie, in Plato's phrase. The baby prince, it was claimed, wasn't James's child at all. Instead, it was a changeling smuggled into the Queen's bed in a warming pan.
For many in England, the only salvation from a fraudulent Catholic succession now lay across the North Sea with William of Orange and his Protestant army. In a coded message, 7 leading parliamentarians invited William to bring a Dutch army to England to defend the Protestant faith and assert his wife Mary's claim to the throne. As William weighed his options, a Mr. Sidney arrived with another letter. It was from John Churchill. Winston reproduces it in facsimile, as well he might, for it is one of the most significant letters in British history.
Mr. Sidney will let you know how I intend to behave myself. I think it is what I owe to God and my country. If you think there is anything else I ought to do, you have but to command me, and I shall pay an entire obedience to it, being resolved to die in that religion that it has pleased God to give you both the will and power to protect.
First sight, this letter is somewhat elliptical, as John Churchill describes his motives for action, patriotism and Protestantism, but not the act itself. But that's hardly surprising, since the act, neither more nor less, to which he was committing himself, was treason. As William would have realised the moment he read the letter, here was England's leading general and James's right-hand man committing himself to help William invade England and, by extension, to overthrow James.
On October the 15th, William embarked 15,000 troops in an armada of over 500 ships.
In England, everybody, including James, knew that the invasion was coming. The rebellion even had a theme song, Lillibolero, whose lyrics mocked the Irish Catholic troops that James was supposed to be bringing over to defend his crown.
It was sung in taverns and street corners across the land. It is said that James really knew there was a military conspiracy when he heard the sentry at his door whistling the tune. On the 5th of November, symbolic day, 1688, William landed at Torbay in Devon. But James quickly concentrated 25,000 men on Salisbury Plain between William and London. His army was larger, but would it be loyal? James hurried from Windsor to join his troops, with John Churchill at his side, newly promoted Lieutenant General.
On the 23rd of November, James held a council of war. John Churchill, as usual, believing that attack was the best form of defence, recommended advancing towards William. But the French general that James had put in overall command instead advised falling back towards London. James concurred. That same night, John Churchill and 400 officers and men crept out of the royal camp and rode for their lives to join William.
This wounding personal betrayal unnerved James. He abandoned the army and raced back to London, sending orders that Sarah Churchill be arrested.
Open the door!
But John's wife was ready.
Sarah and Anne managed to slip down the back stairs of the palace and out of the capital before the orders could be put into effect. "God help me," cried James. "Even my children desert me."
It was the end. James fled England for France. With scarcely a shot fired, the English had got rid of the last king who had ever tried to claim absolute authority over them. From now on, Parliament would be sovereign, and the monarchy, in the shape of William and Mary, would be Protestant.
And England at that point embarks on a new path, not simply a dependent, a satellite of France, but a new rival power representing a new, different way of doing things. And at that moment, in 1688, with Marlborough's choice, with that letter that we looked at, a new chapter, or rather a new book, a new volume in English and European history opens. And it continues through war after war, with first of all France as the enemy, then Germany. And that, of course, is what Churchill sees his own career about. It's what he's trying to remind people in 1932 and 1933 is at stake.
Representative government, democracy, the legacy of 1688, his own ancestors' legacy. These are all at stake. And Churchill feels that it will be his destiny to take up Marlborough's sword to defend them.
Writing the first volume of Marlborough had opened Winston's eyes and helped him to be the first to recognise the Nazi threat to Britain. Over the next 6 years, his work on the remaining 3 volumes took him still further. It gave added weight to his repeated warnings of the dangers of German rearmament, and as time went by, it marked him out more and more as the man to lead Britain in her forthcoming life and death struggle with Hitler and the Nazis.
And in the next episode, we'll see how writing Marlborough helped Winston back to power.